Hello friends, and thank you for joining me out here again. I don't know about you, but Halloween is my absolute favorite time of year. Cool weather, fresh apple cider, and beautiful autumnal foliage really make the month of October very special. One of my favorite things to do this time of year is revisit classic horror stories, whether they be on film or in print. One of my all-time favorites is the story of Ichabod Crane and his unfortunate encounter with the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Seeing as it's Halloween, I figured it would be fun to recite an excerpt of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow for you. There's much more to the story, so I suggest you take the time and read it for yourself to really get the full experience. In the meantime, get nice and cozy around the fire, grab some hot apple cider, and enjoy. It was very late when Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, traveled homewards along the lofty hills above Tarrytown, which he had traversed so cheerfully in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop riding quietly beside him. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the faint barking of a watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. No signs of life occurred to him but the occasional chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker, the stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tree which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragic story of Major Andre, who had been taken prisoner, and was universally known as Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations seen and heard near it. As Ichabod approached the tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was the wind sweeping through the dry branches. As he approached, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly saw that it was a place where the tree had been struck by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle, but it was the rubbing of one bow upon another as they swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy, thickly wooded glen. A few logs, laid side by side, served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild vines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. It was at this spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured. This has since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful is the man who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up all his resolution, gave his horse a kick in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the animal made a lateral movement and ran against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked hard with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and bushes. Ichabod now bestowed both whip and heel upon old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the road caught the ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, black and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon him. Ichabod's hair rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or goblin, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up courage, he stammered, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke into a whistle again. Just then, the shadowy object put itself in motion, and, with a scramble and a bound, stood in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, Ichabod could make out a horseman of large dimensions mounted on a huge black horse. He stood aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange companion, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving the dark figure behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod then fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink. He tried to resume his tune, but his parched tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a note. There was something in the dogged silence of his companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon accounted for. On mounting a hill which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, Ichabod was horror-struck to see that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on seeing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping, by a sudden movement, to give his companion the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away they dashed, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his lanky body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his escape. They had now reached the road which leads to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, made a wrong turn and plunged downhill to the left. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the saddle gave way and he felt it slipping from under him. He had just enough time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and he worked hard to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of the horse's backbone, with the violence that he feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring beyond. Suddenly he remembered where the horseman had always disappeared in stories. If I can reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting close behind him. He even felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and the old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the planks and gained the opposite side. Now Ichabod looked behind to see if his pursuer might vanish, as in the legends, in a flash of fire. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod tried to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It hit his head with such a tremendous crash that he tumbled headlong into the dust as Gunpowder and the goblin rider passed him by. The next morning Gunpowder was found without his saddle and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. His students assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about grounds, but no schoolmaster. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle, trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road at furious speed. The tracks were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of the brook, was found Ichabod's hat, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of Ichabod was never found. The mysterious event caused much speculation. Gossip collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. Many of the old stories were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all, and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the headless horseman. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and who told his story all across town, claimed that Ichabod Crane was still alive. The old country wives, however, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became an object of superstitious awe. That may be the reason why the road has been altered, so that it approaches the church by the border of the mill pond. Ichabod's schoolhouse soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by a ghost. The plowboy, walking homeward of a still summer evening, has often heard a voice at the distance, whistling a melancholy tune along the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Like I said, this was just a small excerpt from the much larger story of Ichabod and the Headless Horseman. I highly recommend picking up a copy and reading it yourself, especially around this time of year. It really is a classic American story, and one that has special meaning to me, and one that I hope will have special meaning to you as well. Also, I hear Tarrytown is beautiful this time of year, and it might be worth planning a visit, but if I were you, I'd stay away from old churches or small covered bridges. Anyways, have a very spooky and happy Halloween, and I'll see you soon.